Hello and welcome to our 2020 virtual summer school series, Extension Programming for Everyone through the lens of DEI. We're excited to have so many of you guys helping us get through our final day of the series. I'm Diane Mashburn, Extension Instructor for the University of Arkansas System Division of Agriculture. Our virtual summer school series is co-hosted annually by the Program and Staff Development Committee of the Southern Region Program Leaders Network, along with the National Association of Extension Program and Staff Development Professionals. Thank you to all who contributed to planning this timely and important series. Our session today is Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in Extension Evaluation, and our presenters today are Natalie Cook and Tom Archibald from Virginia Tech. And assisting us with our Q&A today, we have Celeste Carmichael from Cornell Extension. So here's a little bit more about Natalie and Tom. Natalie Cook is an Assistant Professor of Public Health in the Department of Population Health Sciences in the Virginia, Maryland College of Veterinary Medicine at Virginia Tech. She's gonna throw me off with that. Prior to starting this position in February, Natalie spent a year building evaluation capacity as the evaluation specialist for Oklahoma Cooperative Extension Service at Oklahoma State University. Prior, Natalie has worked on extension evaluation at Virginia Tech, where she completed her PhD, at the University of Maryland, and in her home state of New York during her undergraduate studies at Cornell University. Natalie's work includes evaluation capacity building, cultural responsiveness, anti-racism and public health, health equity, community engagement, extension evaluation, and knowledge translation. As a transformative evaluator, Natalie engages in mixed methods and participatory research and works at the intersections of evaluation, health equity, social justice, and human, family, and community development. Tom Archibald is an Associate Professor and Extension Specialist in the Department of Agricultural Leadership and Community Education at Virginia Tech, where he also directs the Feed the Future Senegal Youth in Agriculture Project. A winner of the American Evaluation Association, Marcia Gutentag Promising New Evaluator Award, he serves on the Board of Directors of the Eastern Evaluation Research Society and is an Associate Editor of the Journal Evaluation and Program Planning. He received his PhD in Adult and Extension Education from Cornell University in 2013. With Dr. Cook and Dr. Rodney Hobson, he has published on culturally responsive evaluation, which is an important part of his practice and research. So we want to welcome both of them here today, and with that, I will go ahead and let them take it away.
Thank you so much, Diane and Celeste and all of the organizers of this virtual summer school. It is a real honor for Natalie and I to be here with you sharing a few thoughts on the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion in extension evaluation. Thanks all for completing that poll. It's very heartening to see that both there is a strong perception that this is an important topic in our work, and also that there's still room to grow, that folks are really, that was an interesting normal distribution in the self-assessment of current competency. So today, Natalie and I hope to share with you some theoretical approaches as well as some practical how-tos for you to continue to address these issues in your evaluation. Natalie and I have been working together on evaluation capacity building and related themes since about 2009, and we've collaborated in numerous ways. So this is yet another opportunity for us to build on our shared passion for this work, to share it with you as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Natalie.
Thanks, Tom. And thanks everyone for joining us on a Friday afternoon. I'm really happy to be here and to be contributing to this conversation. So here's an overview of what we're going to be covering today. We're going to start with a little introduction of ourselves and kind of model for you what we hope you'll do moving forward in your work, which is, you know, coming to your work as a human being and recognizing that your experiences shape the lens through which you see the world and through which you do your work. And we'll briefly discuss some key terms. We won't spend too long on that since you've had a whole week on this stuff. We'll present some of the theories and frameworks that inform our approach and that we hope that you'll learn from. Then we'll talk about how diversity, equity, and inclusion show up throughout the evaluation cycle. And then we'll finally close with some tips on where to go from here so that we're kind of setting you up to put some of this into practice. So be thinking about at least one thing that you can do after you end today's session. Then we'll have some time for questions and answers.
So to start with, we wanted to model, as Natalie said, a good practice in foregrounding diversity, equity, and inclusion in evaluation and in the programming cycle writ large, which is to be honest and transparent and open about our own positionality, our own perspectives, our own standpoints. So to do so, I think it's important for me to say that I am a white man who is tenured at a land-grant university, and I am able-bodied and English is my first language. And I realize, as I will say later on in considering the notion of whiteness, that this confers a certain amount of privilege on me, which I cannot put aside when I'm doing evaluation work. It influences how I see things, how I interact with the world. And in that way, it's an important starting point as I try to be more sensitive to equity, diversity, and inclusion in my evaluation work. Natalie?
I'm Natalie Cook. I'm a Black woman scholar. I'm doubly first generation. I'm a first generation American, as my parents are immigrants. My mom is Trinidadian, my father is Jamaican. He didn't really help raise me though, so I feel more Trinidadian than Jamaican. But so I can relate to some of the issues related to immigration and sometimes of othering that happens unintentionally. And I came from a low income background. And so while I feel like I'm kind of climbing out of poverty, I definitely see myself as a straddler who can relate to community members who might be experiencing hardships. So to get started, like I said, we're going to quickly go over some terms. A metaphor that I really appreciate to help talk about these terms, diversity, equity, and inclusion, comes from Robert Sellers. He talks about programming or initiative as kind of a party where diversity might be who's included, who's being invited to participate. Equity might be who gets to contribute some songs to the playlist. Is only one person deciding all the songs, or does everyone kind of have a say in what we're going to be listening to? And inclusion might be who has the opportunity to dance. And I would take that even further and say, maybe we're not just dancing. Maybe some participants might like to sing or do something else that they feel able and confident in doing.
And now the notion of transformative is really one of those words which almost can become a buzzword because it's so broad and is applied in so many different contexts. Those of you who have studied education probably came across transformative pedagogy, transformative learning. And in the way that Natalie and I approach evaluation, it's a key concept promoted in large part by Donna Mertens, who for a long time was a professor at Gallaudet University. And but it's also applicable to how we think about extension work in general, that we're not just trying to make small changes to knowledge or attitudes or skills, but that we're trying to fundamentally transform systems to improve the outcomes for the families and individuals who we're trying to serve. And so we'll share a little bit more about what that means in terms of evaluation. And very briefly, but we have some reading material we can share later, Natalie's dissertation actually focused on a new approach to evaluation capacity building called transformative evaluation capacity building, which centers the power dynamics and participation and positionality at the heart of any evaluation capacity building effort. So we'll touch on that briefly later. In my introduction, I mentioned the concept of whiteness. I hope this is a notion that has come across your screens as at least some point on this summer series, and also probably since the very tragic murder of George Floyd now a few months ago, the issues of those of us who want to do something better, those of us who are white, I should say, want to intervene and practice anti-racism. One of the first steps that we need to do, those of us who are white or who identify as white, is to understand what whiteness is and what it means. So this article, which is from quite a while ago, I believe as far back as 1989, uses the metaphor of unpacking the invisible knapsack. And you see just at the bottom right of that screen cap, there's 1 point. If I wish, arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time. And Dr. McIntosh goes on to cite, I think, upwards of 25 similar, just everyday, seemingly just benign aspects of everyday life, which make the power of whiteness invisible, but which, if you stop to think about it, really can interact with and affect how those of us who are white, walk through the world, and how, when we're trying to evaluate a program, could come into play. And that invisibility of it is also something that Richard Dreyer has addressed in an article also from the 80s. And he really emphasized how this othering, Natalie mentioned already the notion of othering. If we see race as just something that resides amongst those who are non-white, then there's a certain power in that, and that is one manifestation of white privilege. So even when I was using the word we earlier, that assumed that I was part of a group which is white, and that many out there listening may also identify as that group. Now, we do assume also and hope that there are folks from all races and ethnicities joining us today, but we know that Extension as a system has often struggled to not only reach more diverse audiences, but also to have more diverse representation amongst our own ranks. And this ties into something that the critical pedagogy scholar Bell Hooks has written on in terms of how those of us who are white and well-meaning, we don't want to be racist, we don't want to be discriminatory, but just by existing within the confines and the structures of the systems of white supremacy that characterize our nation, we tend to often end up resisting calls for change. This is why Robin DiAngelo has written the text about white fragility. And in brief, this actually evokes something Martin Luther King wrote from his letters from the Birmingham jail, where he said, he's not as concerned with the KKK. He's concerned with the white liberal who would prefer security and peace over justice. Now, this is not to say that the KKK is good by any means. So across the political spectrum, folks like Bell Hooks, Martin Luther King are calling for real change. And this one last point on the Bell Hooks quote, this raises the notion of intersectionality, which has been very well laid out by Kimberly Crenshaw. So Bell Hooks, as a Black woman and feminist, can struggle against racism, but at the same time struggle against the patriarchy, and at the same time struggle against white feminists who would seek to in some way efface her existence. So all of these are it's a lot, but it's things that we need to consider, intersectionality, positionality, as we approach this issue in evaluation. So relatively briefly, we want to we know that we're here to talk about DEI in evaluation, extension evaluation specifically, but we know some of you may not do evaluation regularly as part of your job. You might be seeking to just understand a little bit more what is evaluation in general. So we're going to just take about 5 minutes to give sort of the quickest possible version of Eval 101, and then we'll get back to the topic of DEI. So one of the most frequently cited and used definitions of evaluation is from Michael Scriven, which focuses on the systematic process of determining the merit, worth, or value of things. And we're going to come back to that notion of values and valuing in just a few moments. Another common definition is from Carol Weiss, who was one of the founding mothers of the professional field of evaluation. And she adds on to her definition here a few nuances, such as that evaluation can and should focus on both the processes of a program as well as the outcomes. And there's some comparative nature. So you have to set a normative statement about what is quality, what is good, what is enough, and therefore values come back into the picture. And then finally, that the purposes of evaluation are not just accountability, but also program improvement. So Natalie and myself and others of our colleagues at the Cornell Office for Research on Evaluation, such as Monica Hargraves and Bill Trosham and others, basically pulled a few different definitions of evaluation to come up with this one, which we find is really practical. It's really sort of when push comes to shove, what is it that you're trying to do when you evaluate? And if you just focus on those words that are in orange, we're trying to collect information or insights that are accurate and useful and credible in a way that's feasible. And then the real key is to relevant stakeholders. And that's where values come into play again. Because a program participant might find some information valuable or valid, whereas the funder might find that less valid. So it's always a negotiation process, and it's always a question of setting boundary judgments. Now, just to emphasize, this is all about answering evaluation questions. By that, we do not mean the items that you would see on a survey. We mean the big overarching questions about the program that you're trying to answer. Now, finally, I mentioned, of course, we often think of evaluation for accountability, but even that concept we need to unpack a little bit. So accountability to whom? Certainly accountability to funders, which could exist at the federal level, meaning, of course, USDA NIFA, funders at the state level, and then also at the county level, whether it be a legislator group or another committee. Accountability to foundations or other sources of funding, but also accountability to the program participants, to the families of program participants, to the people who are the purported beneficiaries of our programs. We're also accountable to them. And that is another way of bringing in a DEI lens and thinking about evaluation. Then beyond that, accountability is just one purpose of evaluation. The purposes that Natalie and I and a lot of folks who have influenced us have focused a lot more on are the roles of evaluation to lead to adaptive management, learning, and then ultimately social betterment. In so much as cooperative extension is trying to make the world a better place for those who we can touch through our programs, evaluation is right there with the programming as trying to help us make the world a better place the most efficiently and effectively and adaptively and equitably as we can. So just to wrap up this little bit of an intro, I've mentioned the word values a number of times, and I can report to you that the role of values and valuing in evaluation is an ongoing debate. It has been from the very founding of the field of evaluation. I just saw that a colleague, Zach Tilton, was digging into the archives of our major professional organization, the American Evaluation Association's listserv. And the very first post in 1994 was from Patricia Rogers of Better Evaluation about the role of values in evaluation. And just this year, 2 volumes of the Australian Evaluation Journal came out looking just at values and valuing. And it's a very tricky topic. You can't get away from it because, as you see from that first bullet point, the word value is in the middle of evaluation. But how do values come into evaluation? Whose values count and whose values matter? That's harder to say. Does the evaluator's values matter? Is it just about the funder? Is it the program participant? So doing evaluation in a way, and then this brings us back to the concept of diversity, equity, and inclusion, being very transparent and explicit about whose values count, whose values matter, is going to be very important to do not just equitable evaluation, but quality evaluation as well.
So now let's talk about why diversity, equity, and inclusion matter in evaluation work. Well, as the theme suggests, you're talking about extension programming for everyone, right? So we want to know, who are we reaching? Evaluation should help us not only see who we're reaching, but figure out why we're reaching only those people, why certain groups might be underrepresented or missing, and maybe even figure out how to reach those individuals and groups. It also relates because we're thinking about how you can use your programs to make the most difference, to have the biggest impact. And we know that participant buy-in and relevance is going to affect the impact that you're able to have on your stakeholders and your participants. In terms of understanding the whole impact, we hope that you're able to achieve your outcomes and your objectives in your extension programming, but you also want to be mindful that you might be having some unintended outcomes. And sometimes those are positive, like sometimes maybe people were building relationships when you didn't even think that that would happen, but sometimes you might be doing harm, and you want to be able to have that on your radar and to address that as quickly and ethically as possible. It's also relevant because it has a lot to do with validity and efficacy, not only instrumental, but also as we're thinking about ethics and how we're dealing with community members, especially those who are sometimes the most vulnerable in society. And you really want to move beyond tolerance. It's one thing to invite people to the party, right? To have them there just so they're there. But what about really including them to respect and honor who they are, what they know? You might be able to learn from them.
And building on those perspectives, I think a term that has come onto many people's radars in the process of this country starting to grapple more explicitly with issues of racism and police brutality, etc., is the notion of anti-racism. So there's an excellent book out by Dr. Ibram Kendi called essentially How to Be an Anti-Racist. And part of his central thesis is that there's no such thing as being not racist. You are either racist in a given moment or you are anti-racist. So that really puts the onus on those of us who want to do community change work, including evaluation, to be more active and intentional. So, and this also helps us shift the lens away from, often when we think of racism, we think of individual actions, like somebody saying something bigoted. Now, while that does happen, and while it happens with far too great frequency, part of what Dr. Kendi is talking about is how we are complicit in the systems of racism if we're not actively trying to challenge them. So you could be going about your work not using any racial slurs, not judging your colleagues who look different from you differently, but if you're not actively engaging in anti-racism, according to these analyses, you're then complicit in racist structures. And that brings us to another very difficult topic, which is the role of social justice as part of the land grant mission, especially in relation to recent excellent reporting done by the High Country News, which really shined a light on how very explicitly and clearly all of our land grants exist because of stealing of land. That's, I mean, it's written into our mission, the land grant mission. But where was that land granted from? So if you've not yet read the High Country News report on which parcels of land were used to found your land grant, I highly recommend you to check that out because there are still people living there. You can see what they're up to now and where the original inhabitants of that land were moved to. And that's just another perspective on equity and inclusion when you're doing extension evaluation.
So this orientation is about transformative evaluation, which is really focused on centering social justice. And Tom and I just kind of covered why that's relevant for extension evaluation. So programming should not just be to carry on the status quo, but rather to make the world a better place or to leverage knowledge for societal improvement, as we say in extension. This begs the case for mixed methods. So thinking back to the party metaphor and being inclusive, maybe not only inviting people to dance, but to sing as well. That's a good analogy here for using mixed methods. When we only rely on surveys or text-based or traditional methods of evaluation, we're missing the opportunity to really hear people's stories and to invite them to share how they see the world and how they're experiencing the program and what the program means for them. If you limit your evaluations to solely quantitative measures or to solely surveys, then you're really missing out on some potential impact that you could be reporting on. And culturally responsive evaluation, which is offered by well-renowned scholar and practitioner Rodney Hobson. He talks about CRE, or culturally responsive evaluation, as a really holistic framework. So we're not just thinking about the numbers or one piece, but we're really thinking about the whole person and how they interact with the whole program. So CRE is a theoretical, conceptual, and inherently, because we're talking about values, like Tom said, political position. CRE includes the centrality and attunement or paying attention to culture in the theory and practice of evaluation. And CRE recognizes that demographic, socio-political, and contextual dimensions, locations, perspectives, and characteristics of culture matter fundamentally in evaluation. So you notice that's not just language translation. It's not enough to just offer a translation or to have the survey available in Spanish too, for example. As you see in the schematic on the left that Dr. Hobson created for us, culturally responsive evaluation is right there in the middle. So it's not a step that you go through at one point in the evaluation cycle, like when you're working on your measures or maybe an analysis, you want to remember, oh yeah, race might matter, but really it's about building in an attention to culture throughout. And even as you go back to your logic models and your program design, thinking about culture then too, because who are we to decide what program success looks like? Don't we care about what our participants value as well? If we want the programs to really mean something to our participants, why not think about them as whole people and acknowledge the role that culture may play in that for them?
And just to speak a little bit as to how culturally responsive evaluation has really moved into the mainstream in the broader evaluation sphere, there is a conference dedicated uniquely to this concept. It is the Culturally Responsive Evaluation and Assessment Conference, which happens every year in Chicago. We just learned this year it will be postponed due to COVID. But it's a space where people who are interested in this can come and share ideas. But beyond that, even within the annual American Evaluation Association conference and other local affiliates of evaluation associations around the country and around the world, really, there are folks providing keynotes, resources, topics, papers on this topic. So it's really heartening to see that this is no longer seen as something that people can just opt into or opt out of, as so like someone might say, oh, I like using social network analysis. Oh, I like using culturally responsive evaluation. We're now coming to the place where, well, yes, social network analysis might be right for some evaluations. Maybe that's the right tool for the job, but all evaluations ought to take on a CRE lens if they are to be valid and quality and ethically sound. Another framing similar to culturally responsive evaluation, but also that brings additional perspectives to the table, is the notion of indigenous or decolonizing methodologies. So within evaluation, Nikki Bowman has been one of the many leading thinkers of this space. So you see with the medicine wheel image on the left, an approach to essentially a conceptual or theoretical framework rooted in indigenous ways of knowing that can be used to understand programs, perspectives, and the outcomes that are supposed to be happening as a result of programs. The book shown on the right is one of the best go-to sources for trying to understand what do we mean when we talk about decolonizing methodologies. And at the heart of it, it has to do with power and participation and whose reality counts, whose knowledge counts. So, and in some cases, this doesn't mean completely throwing out the existing dominant methods that we use. In some cases it will, and there are some creative ways to think about non-standard, if you will, ways of, and that's of course centering the dominant white colonial methods as standard, which is somewhat problematic in and of itself, but as expanding the tent of the panoply of methods that we have to collect data on programs. So we can possibly share some examples with that. Since I do work in Senegal, as was mentioned by Diane, I've been interested for a while in this concept of Made in Africa evaluation, which is emerging over the last few years and is especially pertinent in terms of international development evaluation.
So the goal here is really to strive for equitable evaluation, to align evaluation practices with an equity approach, and more powerfully, to use evaluation as a tool for advancing equity. Evaluators have to simultaneously consider all of these. They have to consider diversity, not only in recruitment and which participants they're reaching, but also on their teams and who's included in the staff and the organizational structure. Moving beyond cultural to disciplines, beliefs, and lived experiences, cultural appropriateness and validity of their methods. So again, including multiple and mixed methods, sometimes not relying on things that require text or verbal output, but maybe including methods that rely on photos or storytelling or dance or drama. There's a whole slew of methods that you can learn about and think about how they might fit in your programming and evaluation efforts. So I encourage you to do that research and look for some new methods. Ability of the design to reveal structural and systems level drivers of inequity, present day and historically, because we know that history matters and can color or shape the way that some of our constituents interact with us, and the degree to which communities have the power to shape and own how evaluation happens. So sometimes using a participatory approach where it's not just the evaluator or the agent or educator who's deciding how we're going to evaluate this program, but sometimes asking the participants, so how are we going to know if we're making progress here? What would you like to do? What's going to matter for you? So just another representation of this information. One piece of this is that evaluation and evaluative work should be in service of equity. So not a tack on, but thinking about it as part of the reason. Evaluative work can and should answer critical questions about structures and systems and the historical, the things that have contributed to why things are the way that they are, the effect of a strategy in different populations, and we'll get into some more of that later. But also, evaluative work should be designed and implemented commensurate with the values underlying equity work, which means multicultural validity. So not only relevant and applicable and meaningful for white people, but for many people, and oriented toward participants' ownership. So again, trying to include some participatory methods. So where does DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, show up in the evaluation cycle? Well, it shows up throughout, as you saw in the schematic that Dr. Hobson offered. It should really be mainstream and throughout. Programming and evaluation planning, and I include program planning here, although this is a session on evaluation, because evaluation should result in some reprogramming or in some changes to design. So you're not just done once you've designed a program. Evaluation should inform ongoing program change for hopefully improvement. In program implementation, in terms of who you're able to reach, who you're able to retain, thinking about why certain groups are consistently dropping out of programs or why you're consistently not able to reach some people, and thinking carefully about how you're framing that. Are you thinking, oh, well, those people are just not interested in this? Or is there a way that you could help them realize the connections or the benefits that they might have in participating? Also thinking about how you define success. Sometimes outcomes and understandings of success can be very Western or white-centric, but some families, participants, farmers, and other stakeholders might have a different idea of success. And it's not that you might have to replace your version, but maybe you want to add a measure that might help understand your progress towards meeting their understanding of success as well. Also methods, as we talked about, including mixed methods to help advance multicultural validity. Your reporting strategy, so maybe not having only written reports, but maybe also quick videos, including some infographics that some groups might be more responding to, maybe doing phone call disseminations or quick reports for people who only rely on the phone but would like to hear what the results of an evaluation was. And representation, not guessing people's races, having them declare what their race is. And yes, sometimes that means more work on the data end. Man, they check 2 things. Yes, you'll have to figure that out. Give them the opportunity to say who they are. Relevance, appropriateness, readability, access. Are you only posting things? If you're only, for example, publishing, then only people with access to journal articles will be able to see what you say. Is there a community report that anyone in the community can also access? And will they be able to understand what you write? Will they be able to read it and comprehend it? Is there someone you could work with to not only translate, but use some language that might be more relevant or impactful for them. So while I know that you all will be really good at this and that you'll do your best to be reflective and thoughtful in your decisions throughout the evaluation process, sometimes you might make a mistake. You have to just accept that from the beginning and be willing to try and sometimes fail. My mom always said it's better to try and fail than fail to try, and that's really important here. So sometimes you might tell people, I don't see color. I love everyone. Everyone's welcome here. And not seeing color is actually problematic because it means you don't see me. I have color, I'm brown, I'm beautiful. So acknowledge that. Now, it's not to say you have to say you brown people, but just avoid saying you don't see color. That's not actually helpful. Instead, acknowledge that culture does matter. Thinking back to Dr. Hobson's schematic, think about the principles of culturally responsive evaluation where you acknowledge that culture matters, and so you have to see it. Also, don't have DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, as an afterthought. Invest ahead of time in a DEI specialist or partner with them on your programming and evaluation efforts. So it's not that only the evaluation specialist should be working on this, but if you're able to get a DEI specialist, include them in the evaluation too. And that goes back to also having a diverse staff or organizational representation as well. It really helps when you're not having to do as much guesswork because the people in the community are actually represented within the organization. Now, it's not to say to always ask a person of color or a Black person to just do this because this is for your people. You know, we want to really respect people's whole selves and not tokenize and not come to see people of color as just ambassadors for their race who are kind of obligated to shed light on these issues for you. Also, be mindful of exclusion by design. And this is really about noticing things that might not be on your radar. So that means it's going to take extra intentionality for you to notice. But embedding CRE in your programming, evaluation, and redesign will help you do that. And hiring community members for advising. Maybe you're holding a paid insight panel where community members who are particularly like your target population or maybe the people who are missing, who you've identified as missing, could help you understand that maybe aside from the content, it's because you're holding the program in this place. This group does not want to be in that place. And you might learn, oh, if I hold another program here, or if I move it to this other place, I might be able to reach people better. And again, it's not just about physical spaces and content, but it's also about an approach and maybe recognizing that certain people don't like sharing things in public. So they're not going to do this type of method you thought would be a great idea or whatever it may be. Just listening to community members to help you understand what's going to work best.
Yes, and that I think is an important reminder that while we are focusing a lot on race and ethnicity, and especially anti-Black racism as an issue that we need to avoid in our evaluation, we really intend this presentation and the frameworks and tools provided there within to touch on all the different axes of difference and diversity across ability, types of ability and disability, gender, sexual orientation, etc., linguistic background, all the various perspectives. And in that vein, just 2 or 3 days ago, there was a new volume of New Directions for Evaluation, which brought together voices of Black evaluators, Latinx evaluators, etc., to look across these intersectional axes of difference and diversity about what the implications are for evaluation. And we can share some of that later as well. Now to turn to the mechanics. Now, one common question around diversity, equity, and inclusion is around how to ask demographic information. And Natalie and I are not trying to say that we have the best way here. This is just a way that we've been thoughtful about. We've looked into the research from different advocacy groups who support the rights of different historically marginalized populations to try to be cognizant of the ways of self-representation that members of those groups would prefer. because when you don't offer someone a response, especially if it's check one or it's a required question with little asterisks on it, right, that they can't go on to the rest of the survey until they answer that. And if fundamentally, just based on their own reality, they are not able to choose one of those questions, then they're going to be frustrated with your survey and you'll probably reduce your response rate. This also, before I forget, one fundamental question about demographic information is only collect that which you will use or that which you need, because otherwise it's not only is there no point, but you're putting an undue burden on people to have to just the mechanical burden of filling out more questions, but also especially if there's something that's not inclusive in your line of questioning, then you're causing harm to them by making them experience that. For instance, my wife is from Gabon in Africa, and she's encountered surveys before that have the closest option for her is African American, but the definition of African American does not cover her, because while she is American, she's an American citizen and she lives in the US, that terminology she knows does not pertain to her. She would prefer to choose Black or African. So for the rest of that survey, she would either close it out or was probably not, the rest of her responses were maybe not as valid. So I know we need demographic information for federal reporting and often state reporting. And in many cases, we don't have a lot of leeway as to changing the categories. There has been some movement at the US Census level, which I'll point to in just a moment. But if ever you're doing a more local, small p program evaluation, and you have the capacity to tailor the demographic questions to that which is more appropriate, here are some possible suggestions. And again, this is just one set of options. In terms of race and ethnicity, one thing the census has done this year is to really unpack that very complicated and fraught connection between those two constructs. What is the difference between race and ethnicity? So folks who study culturally responsive inquiry have now suggested this way over on the left of the screen. First of all, allow people to check all that apply, because the terminology is also quite fraught in this area, but many members of the community who you could say are mixed or multiracial would not have their one option there, but would want to check multiple options to make up who they are, to constitute who they are. Also, strangely, the Middle Eastern or North African option was missing from most surveys until very recently. And so that's a huge swath, millions of people who had nothing else to check. So they would have always had to put other, I guess. So the census has added that. So those are categories which are not perfect, but they tend to represent the majority of folks. Then there's an open text box for ethnicity, because ethnicity, so of course race is a social construct. It's not biological, even though it presents some biological characteristics, which leads to people, and that's why, as Natalie said earlier, don't just look across the room and write down how many Black people, how many Latinos you have in the room. That's not a good practice. But ethnicity as a broader construct can be, just look at the examples, Korean, so that's a nationality. Mexican American, that's indicating someone's origins while still firmly placing them as an American. For Indigenous peoples and First Nation peoples, they may first identify with their original either ceded or unceded territory, as well as, say, considering themselves to be white or American Indian or what have you. Then there's the gender and the transgender and the sexual orientation line of questioning, which is also difficult to figure out how to get it right. This is not necessarily right, but this is based on our research into the good practices in this area, what to do. Although I do see, Natalie and I were just talking about gender identity should probably be woman and man instead of female and male, because female and male tend to be used more with animals rather than humans. So your identity, for instance, my identity is as a man, not as male per se. And then in extension, we might feel hesitant to list these categories that we know many of our constituents and participants would be either offended by or would be confused by. So that's a difficult question, to be very honest. You have to decide, okay, sexuality studies say that these exist. We have people in our programs who identify this way. Are we going to give them the option or not? And that's ultimately up to each evaluator or program person.
Also, notice that all the options are presented in alphabetical order. So hierarchically, you're not placing white people or heterosexual people as the norm or the better by presentation group. That's also a best practice to be mindful of. So where do we go from here? What are you going to do to improve your DEI work in extension evaluation? Well, the first thing I'd ask you to do is commit. Understand that this is a cyclical and not a linear process, and so that means there's no destination. This is ongoing work. And that should resonate well with you as extension professionals who are lifelong learners. Reflect. Transformation begins with you. Before you can change your work and change your organization, think about who you are as a professional, why you're doing this work, what you assume to be true about what help is for people or what the right thing to do is, what success looks like, and commit again to active lifelong learning, relearning, unlearning. Listen. Throughout the process of stakeholder engagement, revisit your stakeholder map and look, again here, you have to work extra hard and be intentional because you're looking for what's not there. Don't expect more free labor from Black and brown people. So don't just expect to just ask them, can you fix this for me? No one's showing up or things like that. Pay them for their labor. Black and brown people have already contributed so much free and underpaid labor that it's time to maybe recognize and honor that what they're contributing, like what you're contributing, is knowledge and expertise. And that should be rewarded or incentivized in some way. Listen to and incorporate feedback. So not just hearing from them so you can say that you heard from them, but thinking carefully and asking them about how you can act on and apply the suggestions or feedback that they might offer. And be ready to do some redesign. I hope you have a logic model. If you do, go back to it. And if you don't, design one from a CRE perspective. Think about where the problematic assumptions may lie in your theory of change. Do you assume that this leads to this because of a white-centric lens? Do you assume that all families should look a certain way in an FCS program, or that I'll leave it there. What about your evaluation plan? Do you include multiple or mixed methods? Do your participants have an opportunity to share in the way that is meaningful to them? In your reporting strategy, do you use multiple methods or do you only share text? Do you only publish and share one-pagers with legislators, for example? Do you also disseminate information back into the community in a way that is valuable, relevant, and credible to the community? So commit, reflect, listen, and design and redesign. Remember, this is cyclical, there's no endpoint, so you don't achieve cultural competence, but you're striving for cultural relevance and responsiveness, and plan for the long haul. To use a cheesy metaphor, this is not a sprint, it's a marathon. So be ready as extension professionals to engage in lifelong learning, to be reflective, and to try to improve the way you address issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion in your extension evaluation work.
All right, Natalie and Tom, thank you so much for such a presentation that I think allowed us all to sit back and reflect and see all of the good work that is yet to do. There were a lot of kudos for the resources and references that you mentioned, and a request that we put some of those resources in the reference document that goes along with the slides that will be posted on the NAEP SDP site. So just want to let you know that people appreciated, you know, bringing up a lot of documentation in your presentation. So there were a couple of, well, there was a lot of really great questions, but we'll see what we can get to here. First is just wondering if you can talk a little bit more about testing instruments or ways to prove that diversity is honored. So you've given lots of suggestions, but if you want to just kind of reflect on that a little bit more.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to the general good practice of pilot testing, which lets us also think about the notion that we touched on a few times of multicultural validity, which was introduced by Karen Kirkhart. So pilot testing is an important step in once you've prepared your data collection tool before really unleashing it on your sample. And I'll admit, I was working with a student once and we forgot to pilot test the tool. And while it didn't lead to any, I don't know that it led to any culturally inappropriate data collection, it led to some less valid data collection. So it happens to all of us. But I think if you do pilot test, you could bring multicultural validity as an intentional and explicit criterion into the pilot testing process. So say you have a survey and your sample is going to have people of numerous races and ethnicities. Well, then don't just pilot test it with white participants for whom English is their first language. It might take a little bit more effort, but if you pilot test it with a stratified sample, even if it's just 5 or 6 people who represent a few of the different areas of diversity that are going to be reflected in your eventual real sample, they might be able to tell you, oh, that word means something different in my community, or I don't know what that means, and I trust you enough to tell you, like what's a canoe or something like that. And then you can change that before you send it out to hundreds and hundreds of people. So there's no way to really prove that a data collection approach is perfectly, just reflecting on some of Natalie's last points, there's no end point. There's no perfect gold standard culturally responsive data collection tool. But if you pilot test it with an equity lens first off, it might be more equity focused, and then also considering possibly triangulating with other types of data sources, because maybe someone says, okay, the survey is accurate to my lived experience, but you're missing a huge part of the story about my experience with this program, which I could also tell you in a 20-minute interview. So then that allows you to not just test that instrument, but step back and test the overarching data collection approach as well.
Great.
That's great, Tom. And it's also helpful to maybe go back to that group that you consulted with and do a member check after you're done and ask them, does this kind of feel right? Do you think I kind of captured what you were going for? That can be helpful too afterwards.
That is a wonderful reminder to slow down, right? Slow down and take some time to pilot you know, any of the instruments that we're using. So great, thank you. I think we have time for just one more question. And we'll ask this one. The Indigenous Medicine Wheel model was noted as fascinating. Can you share an example of how that would be applied?
That is a great question. And I myself have not used it. And I believe Nikki Bowman has written some practice notes on how it is used, but I am unfortunately not familiar enough with an actual application of that. Natalie, I can let you think for a second if you have seen it used as well. One, I mentioned briefly in passing this Made in Africa approach, which is something that we are now applying in our, so basically we're starting 4-H in Senegal, and we created a club of decolonizing participatory action youth researchers and equipped them with the tools to come up with their own methodology. So this is not the Native American medicine wheel, but it's a similar parallel indigenous methodology in another context. And they come up with an approach called Coach Barma methodology. So Coach Barma was a 16th century Senegalese philosopher who had a lot of maxims and sayings, which were windows onto everyday life. So these young people, they're high school, early college age, came up with this approach where they would read a series of Coach Barma's sayings to club participants or other people who are engaged in agriculture and youth who are engaged in agriculture, and use those sayings as a lens to then understand their contemporary realities. So it's framed not from a Eurocentric philosophy, but a fundamental Senegalese philosophy that resonates in the day-to-day with them. So unfortunately, not an answer in terms of your question about the medicine wheel, but I have seen a medicine wheel type graphic used as a non-columnar type of logic model. So I think that's one way that Nikki has used it, but just there's so many potential ways to use Indigenous methodologies in evaluation. Natalie, do you have anything else on that quickly? Okay, good.
Awesome. Well, we're running out of time, so I'm so sorry. So we have tons of great questions still in our Q&A box. So be assured, we are going to pose those to Natalie and Tom for them to write up their responses to. And I know there was lots of requests for resources, so we'll put together a Q&A and resource document of some sort, and we will post it up on the NAEPSDP webinar archive page with their recording. So be assured they are going to see them and try to answer those questions as they can. So we will get to those. So thank you again so much. So many things to think about and take away. Thank you to Tom and Natalie today for presenting. So did an excellent job. And thank you to everybody who joined us this week. This was our final session of the 2020 Virtual Summer School. I hope you guys all were able to take something or many somethings away from this week. Remember, we are sharing all of the presentations from this week on that archive page, and I am right now going to share out that information to you guys about how you can get to that. So right now, we have stayed on top of things. Thank you to my tag team member, Celeste, for helping us get this information up. But we have Monday through Thursday already posted and ready for you guys to view. So if you missed one of those previous sessions, feel free to go watch those, look at their resources and everything. So those are ready for you guys. We also would appreciate your feedback about today's session and any of the previous sessions you've watched. So that link was also sent out at the same time. So it is in your chat. So please just take a second, follow that link, or as we bring up the closing slides, there'll be a QR code you can just snap with your phone and follow to the survey there. Just a little bit with that survey, if you need to evaluate multiple sessions, you'll have to go back into that survey to evaluate each of those sessions. So please let us know what key takeaways, what went well, what would you like to see in the future. This topic for this year's virtual summer school came from your feedback. This was asked for back last year, and as I mentioned in the beginning of the week, we never knew how relevant, how timely, how great this topic was going to end up being for this point in time. So thank you again, not only to Tom and Natalie, to all of our speakers this week. Thank you to our great facilitators and everybody for joining us this week. Hope you are able to use this information and help improve not only your own programs, but our extension programs as a whole. So thank you again and have a wonderful weekend.